Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Dolores Tarver. I'm a licensed psychologist here in Georgia, and it is time for the TT Time with Dr. Tarver is a wellness-based podcast. It is not intended to be a substitute for a relationship with a licensed mental health provider. Welcome to June. June is Pride Month as well as National Gun Violence Awareness Month. And so the series this month is entitled We Deserve, and we will be discussing all the things we deserve: safety, respect, to be seen and heard, responsive affirming, and appropriate health care, as well as legislation. In particular, we're going to kick off this episode. Y'all know I get these words all tongue tied. We're going to work on through that though. In particular, this episode, we are going to be discussing creating safe spaces for the LGBTQIA plus community in this episode entitled We Deserve Safe Spaces. So, of course, one of my roles as a mental health provider is to provide information. So, I want to start this episode out and I want to try to be mindful of time because I feel like there's a lot of information I'm trying to pack into this episode. But I do want to start by giving some definitions and resources prior to us moving forward because I think one of the biggest obstacles to creating safe spaces is false information. So, in the event you don't stay tuned for the whole episode, let me go ahead and give you some resources out the gate. So, the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, GLSEN, is actually an organization for students to take action and initiate changes in their schools and communities. GLMA Health Professionals Advancing LGBT Equality works to connect people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender with welcoming healthcare providers. The True Colors United focuses on ending homelessness among the LGBTQ plus youth. Pride Counseling is online therapy. Pride Institute is actually a recovery program for LGBTQIA plus people who are experiencing some addiction and substance abuse issues. PFLAG is a good support group. The Trevor Project has all kinds of great information, but it also has a crisis line for youth. GLAAD is a resource that has a lot of different information for our young people. You can text LGBTQ to 741-741. That's a crisis line. 877-565-8860 is a trans lifeline. 800-843-4564 is the LGBT National Hotline. And of course, 988, our National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And you may be wondering, why am I giving all these resources? We'll kind of get into it and some of the risk factors associated with the LGBTQIA plus population. And so I wanted to kind of get those out initially for people, but I'll also drop them in the description of the episode. So, why are we here? Well, we know that history tends to repeat itself. And for those of you who are wondering where Pride Month came from, what it is, it seems as if we're going back in time. But during the 1960s, there were not a lot of safe spaces for people who were openly gay. So, in June 1969, at Stonewall Inn, which was a popular place for people in the LGBTQ plus population to hang out, the police showed up and targeted individuals. And so following that were riots and protesting that became known as the Stonewall Uprising. 1 year later, on the anniversary of June 28th, 1969, thousands of supporters flooded Manhattan for the Christopher Street Gay Liberation Day March, which is actually regarded as the first gay pride event. And so, as we honor Pride Month, we are recognizing that the March for Equality and Respect isn't anything new. There will always be people who think they can determine what's in or out, acceptable or sinful, normal or an abomination. And unfortunately, the determination for these categories is typically based on information that is manipulated, false, taking scriptures out of context, or cultural social constructs, and there is rarely any scientific support to back these things up. But we begin to internalize them as truth, and we spread this misinformation, which leads us to spaces where people are taking out support for our young people in schools, where people are taking information out of history books, where people are telling you that if you support an organization that has a LGBTQ plus population that is associated with it or supports um, individuals in creating loving and safe spaces, then resources will be withheld. All right, so I've been throwing a lot of terms out, LGBTQIA plus, and I know that for a lot of us, we're like, okay, feels like alphabet soup. What do these letters mean? It is simply an inclusive term that recognizes that there are a variety of different gender identities and sexual orientation. And I know some of us growing up grew up thinking you can only be male and female, and that's it. Well, what we recognize is there is actually a spectrum, and there is a difference between how one identifies with regards to their gender and their sexual orientation. So we're going to break that down. One of the other things that Pride Month does, and this terminology, the LGBTQIA plus, is to decrease instances in which people feel like they're erased or ignored, denied access, or marginalized. L stands for lesbian, G stands for gay, B stands for bisexual. And I think at this point, most people are familiar with those terms, and they just all refer to sexual orientation, which is actually a combination of biological, environmental, emotional, hormonal, and social factors. There is not one construct that goes into our sexual orientation. However, I do want to be clear that sexual orientation is not a choice and cannot be changed through therapy, medication, or persuasion, much to some people's chagrin. Because there is a spectrum with regard to sexual orientation, people may find that they're actually attracted to a variety of people, even though their sexual experiences may be more limited. We can be attracted to men, women, both, or none of the above, right? But what we do know about sexual orientation is that it is stable over time. So, regardless of whether you or someone else tries to change it, it is what it is. And I will say our sexuality or our understanding of our sexuality, I'll phrase it in that way, does change and evolve over time because we are able to maybe have safer spaces to explore things, to better understand us. And that is what we know about sexual orientation in general. When people have safe spaces, they get an opportunity to evolve and develop in ways that don't make them feel shameful or as if they are an abomination or they are a sin or they're an accident or they're a mistake, or they're doing something that is not normal, that ends up oftentimes being demonized in ways because people do confuse sexual orientation with pedophilia. So one identifying as lesbian, gay, or bisexual is not the same as one being a pedophile. A pedophile is an adult who attempts to or actually engages in behaviors such as looking at porn with children, touching children, having sex with children. Minors have never been able to consent. And so any adult that engages in sexualized behaviors with children or sexualizes children, that is not the same as sexual orientation, and they should not be considered synonymous. And they also should not be an indication that simply because somebody identifies as LG or B, they are at risk to your children. They are not. All right, transgender or gender diverse and cisgender are actually relating to gender identity and gender expression. So they are different than sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is who we are sexually attracted to. Our gender identity and our gender expression are also things that differ from the sex that was assigned to us at birth. So I may have been assigned female at birth because I've got female sexual organs, but that doesn't mean that I will identify as female. Same is true for males, because we also recognize that there are people that are born that have sexual organs that are traditional for males and for females. All right, so let me back up a little bit. Okay, so when a person's gender expression does not follow what society deemed as norms for the sex assigned to them at birth, then this is someone who would identify as transgender. These can also include anybody who identifies and expresses their gender outside of the gender binary. So we have set up that males engage in these particular behaviors, look this certain way, and females vice versa, right? But what happens when a person identifies as transgender is they say, hey, that doesn't actually fit for me. Now, it can include clothing, mannerisms, hair, and that includes facial hair, how a person communicates, their interests, a variety of other things. And we often try to limit people to what transgender means. Um, Not everybody transitions necessarily going through sexual reassignment surgery or binding or any of these things. And also, being transgender or gender diverse is not connected to a specific sexual orientation. So we often will say a person who identifies as transgender is gay or lesbian, and that simply is not true. Sexual orientation cannot be assumed based on a gender identity or a gender expression. It's about who we're sexually attracted to, but also how we identify with regard to our gender. You might be like, okay, this is getting confusing. Well, gender is a construct, and so it is internal. That can be whether I feel like I'm a woman, I feel like I'm a man, I feel like I'm non-binary, right? So I don't necessarily ascribe to any of the maybe stereotypical traits that are typically associated with that gender group. Gender identity does not necessarily correspond to sex assigned at birth or with how we express our gender. Cisgender is a person whose gender identity and gender expression align with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So at birth, I was assigned to be a female, and that's how I identify. At birth, I was assigned to be a boy, and that's how I identify. Non binary is a gender identity that may be a combination of or goes beyond the gender binary of female and male. And they prefer pronouns for someone who identifies as non binary, might be they, right? And so as you all are trying to understand, well, why you're either a he or a she, what is this they? They recognizes that I'm a combination of things, not limited to any one thing. And no, there's nothing wrong with that. And no, that does not mean that a person has a disorder or that something happened to them that messed them up in childhood. Nor does it mean that they need to go somewhere for someone to pray that out of them or go to a therapy that tells them that they need to make changes because one, that's not healthy, and frankly goes against the American Psychological Association and our licenses as providers to first do no harm and be supportive and create safe spaces. But also because, as we just talked about, that's not something that's going to change based on somebody else's opinion, right? Then we have Q, which stands for queer or questioning. Queer has been utilized as a negative slur in the past, so I definitely wouldn't just call a person queer without ensuring that that's how they identify. But in general, people who identify as queer are most frequently heterosexual or non cisgender people. Questioning can refer to people who may be unsure of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Maybe they're figuring it out. And it's absolutely appropriate too. That doesn't mean that the person is having an identity crisis. It's just trying to better understand themselves. As we talked about, these are some things that grow over time as I learn more about myself and have safe spaces to explore who I am. Intersex is a term used to describe individuals who are born with variations of sexual characteristics, and they may not fit within the binary definitions of male or female bodies. So, when we talk about somebody who's intersex, the old term was hermaphrodite, which is not anything that we use anymore and definitely not a positive term. But what we recognize is why it's important for us to be mindful about labeling children when they are born as male or female, because that may not necessarily encompass who they are, how they feel, right? And so we want to make sure that a young person's gender identity is something that they can determine, which will happen later on in their lives. Agender is a person who doesn't identify with a gender label or who doesn't use gender as a part of their identity, because gender isn't the only thing that comprises us, right? We're complex individuals. Asexual refers to someone who has little or no sexual attraction. However, they may experience romantic attraction because there is a difference between being connected to someone romantically, intimately, and being attracted to them sexually. Allies are those of us who are supportive of, advocate for, and create safe spaces and policies for the LGBTQIA plus population. And the plus is really important too because it also acknowledges that there are other gender identities and sexual orientations that are not specifically covered with the other initials. Okay, so now that we have all of that out the way, and again, those resources that I gave you earlier can give you more information. Please don't antagonize. someone who identifies as LGBTQIA plus, asking them all these questions and expecting them to give you all this information. If that's something they choose to do, that's fine. But do recognize that you can go and get that information in a lot of places. And so you don't have to question someone, particularly if you're just trying to still understand yourself. And so it may be helpful for you to have more of a foundation before you try to have a discussion with someone. So, why am I talking about we deserve safe spaces? Unfortunately, the LGBTQIA plus population is less likely to access health services and engage with healthcare workers due to stigma and discrimination. And I know you're thinking here in 2023, absolutely, there is still a lot of discrimination that occurs and stigma that occurs. And it can be just even in discussion, questionings about sexual behaviors and risk factors, and how there are assumptions made about how a person is behaving. And so it's very important for us to really look at how, as healthcare providers, and that's mental health and medical health, we are addressing people that come in, all people that come in, but particularly this population who tends to not receive the adequate care that they deserve with certain providers, which is why I gave you some information about a safe space for people to go who are looking for affirming providers, because that's important. We need to have competent providers and providers who are appropriate to deal with whatever issues may arise. As a community, LGBTQIA are also more likely to experience human rights violations that could be violence, torture, criminalization, involuntary medical procedures. And we already discussed the discrimination piece. And this is well documented, unfortunately, about how people are targeted, particularly trans women. There is a lot of vitriol towards trans women because men feel like, oh, well, you're trying to fool me, you're trying to trick me, you're not really a woman. And then also, I've seen a lot of conversations lately about how you're not really a woman from other women. And so you don't get a chance to talk about what your experience is. And as we've talked about before, it's very dismissive of a person's experience simply because a person wasn't born with particular sexual organs doesn't mean that they don't have the same experience and don't see themselves in a certain way. And who are we to determine how someone sees ourselves? Because on the one hand, we'll make that argument. On the other hand, we'll talk about all our other identities and how they're not seen, and how we're treated as if those other identities are invisible. We also recognize that there's denial of care, discriminatory attitudes, and inappropriate pathologic. Yeah, I cannot get my words together. Pathologizing in healthcare settings, right? And so this is where there's deemed that there's an illness, there's a disorder, you're unhealthy. And one of the changes that was made to the most recent edition of a diagnostic and statistical manual that we use to diagnose mental illness is that all of these references were removed. It is not an illness for a person to have a gender identity or a sexual orientation. So what we want to do is support people. How does this affect folks? Well, according to the Trevor Project, that was one of the resources I gave you earlier, 45% of our young people who identify as LGBTQIA plus seriously considered suicide in just the past year. And the Trevor Project, I really like them because they've had the largest sample of young people in particular that identify as LGBTQIA. So they've given us a lot of information to be able to help guide us. They didn't feel supported in their families. And when they didn't feel supported in their families, they lacked social support. That made their rates for suicide made it higher, right? Fewer than 1 in 3 transgender, non-binary youth found their home to be gender affirming. Fewer than 1 in 3. So that means that young people are going to homes in which they're not affirmed, they're not valued, their pronouns are not respected, their names are not respected, and where they're constantly being made to feel that something is wrong with them and they can't be in spaces and be who they are. Also, our youth found that their schools were not very affirming, right? And so when they weren't finding affirming schools, then their suicide attempt rate was higher. But when they found their schools to be affirming, when they found that their support system and their family was supportive, then that decreased their rates of suicide. 60% of LGBTQ youth who wanted mental health care in the past year were not able to get it. 60%. LGBTQ plus youth who live in communities that are accepting had significantly lower rates of attempting suicide. And we also recognize that our LGBTQ plus youth were more likely than non-LGBTQ plus youth to experience violence at school. Started this thing off by saying that June is also National Gun Prevention and Awareness Month, right? So we're trying to stop gun violence. We recognize that there's a lot of violence perpetuated against this population. And so what happens when I'm experiencing violence at school, when I'm being threatened as a young person, as an adult? Like, I'm not connected. I don't feel safe. And so, of course, where is that going to show up at? Mental illness. Now, that's where the mental illness comes from. Higher rates of depression, higher rates of anxiety, trauma responses. That's when I become at risk to engage in self-harm behaviors, including suicide. So, what do I say this all to say? In order for us to create safe spaces, we have to look at the choices that we're making for our young people, our school systems, and for our communities at large. So I know that there are a lot of politicians who believe that removing diversity, equity, and inclusion is going to make our students thrive. But truthfully, we recognize that all students thrive when they better understand how to connect with each other, when they better understand the things that allow a person to be human, right? Like, that's what connects us. If I see you as separate from me, different from me, less than me, that I'm not going to be invested in you. And this is how we can be violent with each other, because I'm not going to have any empathy towards you. I'm not going to see you as a person. And so when I don't see you, it's easier for me to harm you, right? And so it starts with education. And so, yes, if you are unclear, we do need to provide information about gender identity and sexual orientation in our schools. According to the Center for Disease Control, the starting point is our schools. In addition to creating safe spaces in our homes, our kids spend a majority of their time at school. So we do need to talk to our kids about stigma, discrimination, harassment, and microaggressions, and how they affect our LGBTQ plus youth. We need to discuss the negative influences of when our young people are stressed out and they're uncomfortable in their spaces. We need to discuss sexual health and mental health and substance use and violence in schools. We need to discuss these negative outcomes that happen when we don't actually address these things in school. We need to talk about how academic performance is impacted by these risk factors. We understand that youth that are identified as LGBTQ plus are disproportionately impacted by some of these risk factors. And we also want to talk about the protective factors, right? So what can we do to create safe spaces in our schools? We know that connection, inclusiveness, curriculum, right? So we're, taking out books and we're not having discussions that are affirming and inclusive. Those are the things that actually create the spaces that allow our youth to thrive. Yeah, it matters what our bathrooms look like. It matters what kind of pictures we have up. It matters about what the decor we have in a space communicates, whether that's in a school or in an office. And so, yeah, I need to be able to go to a bathroom that connects with how I identify. And again, not be considered to be a pedophile or a perpetrator simply because I identify as a woman, but I was assigned a male at birth, right? And so it's so important that our young people are able to feel comfortable. And we talk about the other side. Well, I don't want my daughter or my son to be uncomfortable with someone who identifies as male but was born and assigned female characteristics, or vice versa. But the truth is, if we do this education, if we have these conversations, we get this understanding, then that young person isn't going to feel threatened. And truthfully, if we ask young people, it is not that they feel threatened; it's that they've been told by adults that they should feel threatened. It is that they've been told by adults that they should be uncomfortable, that this is abnormal, that this is an abomination, that this is a sin. And so we need to address those things. Okay, so that leads me to exploring our faith and our values and our beliefs. right? There are a lot of things that we learn growing up in religious communities, growing up in our families, growing up in geographical locations all around this world. And it's important for us to understand the biases and fears that we have and where they came from. We need to understand our own experiences and our traumas and why we're uncomfortable and sit in that discomfort. We need to do some research and get some understanding. And it's important for us, whether we're educators or administrators or mental health professionals or medical professionals, to do our work so that we can be responsive and well educated. And it's important that we have policies in our work environments and our faith environments that promote safety and respect. When we don't feel like we're competent to work with people, or we don't feel like we're competent to be able to support and encourage and nurture someone, we need to make sure that we've identified spaces where they can go. And it's important for us to commit to not only knowing those resources and how a person can access them, but it may be also important for us to commit to doing some training in our own agencies so that we can get to be that place that's an affirming space. It's important that we listen to our young people, we support our young people, we remind them that they are unconditionally loved, but also for other adults too. We want to respect people's names and their pronouns. We want to see a full person, not just a gender identity or a sexual orientation. And we definitely want to do the work of continuing to protest, run for offices, vote, so that we can create inclusive, protective, safe, affirming environments for everyone. And let me be really clear with all of you. Some of you, your religious views negatively impact your ability to be able to see a person in any other way outside of that. And I do understand that you need to do what's comfortable for you as well. But it does not cost you a thing to be kind. You don't have to understand, you don't have to support, but you don't have to be ugly and critical and demeaning and violent. So, what I will say to you all today is that it takes all of us to create a safe space. But if you're not able to do that, then don't you dare create an unsafe space for someone. Be well.